Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, political scientist and author Stephen Dyson on science fiction and international relations.
What science fiction does is it says, imagine a world in which these things existed that was set up in this way. What can you now deduce about the world of your experience? And I would say international relations theory at its best is doing the same thing. I was stunned when I was researching the original production of Star Trek to find out that one of the major dramas they had in even getting the first episode on screen had to do with Spock. And Spock had pointed ears. And the message came back from some of the networks, well, that's a devil then. This has been a classic role that science fiction in particular has played in American culture and in other cultures, is to put on screen uncomfortable truths or moral dilemmas that are very, very difficult to tackle head on.
Stephen, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
This is a strange moment for me because I've been listening to you talk for some time, primarily through your YouTube channel that you do with Jeff Dudas, also at University of Connecticut, the Yukon Popcast, where you talk about issues of primarily science fiction and film and TV and how it crosses over into politics. But you've expanded that a bit more recently. So
but also Taylor Swift. Was it the Taylor Swift one that drew you in? Because that got the most views.
Drew me in. In fact, I wouldn't say it got me to click at all. But I understand that she's a popular singer. Is this correct?
This was my understanding too. That was Jeff's contribution. He said, we should talk about Taylor Swift. Everyone loves Taylor Swift. And the truth is it's got about 100 times more views than anything else we did, even though it has nothing to do with politics. But that's the internet for you.
It is. I am very aware of Taylor Swift. I'm not a, what is it, Swifter?
Yes, Swiftie.
But there are members of my extended family who are and have been to one of her recent concerts and described it as a quasi-religious experience, and that's good for them. You know, if you can expand your understanding of our existence in this universe through Taylor Swift and her live music, good for you. I have not listened to that episode, and I'm not going to lie, I probably won't.
That's fair enough.
It's not in my happy place. So my happy place is a lot of the other stuff you've focused on, which is the TV, the film, the science fiction, the fantasy, the stuff that a lot of us watch for entertainment. And I guess it's not just political scientists like us, but probably sociologists and economists and, of course, philosophers. But I'll bet you there's a whole bunch of fields of study where people watch entertainment and can't help themselves thinking about, wait a minute, that's not how this part of the economic system works. Or, you know what, that's not how in-group dynamics would play out in this situation. And they can't help but apply their expertise to this, even though they know the media is for entertainment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I agree with you that the prime goal of, in the case of what we're talking about today, science fiction and fantasy on television and film is entertainment. But I'd also suggest that these things are part of a broader cultural conversation about how societies try to make sense of themselves, try to make sense of their politics, try to make sense of like uses of power, the way that people relate to one another. And so I would suggest and sort of have suggested in my work that there is not such a clear dividing line between the sort of scholarly or professional study of power dynamics and how they might be portrayed in a fictional setting.
Let me phrase this carefully because I know there are some very strong opinions on this, but do you come at the field of what I've called science fiction and fantasy with a strong belief as to whether we should just call it all speculative fiction or whether there are important distinctions between science fiction and fantasy? When I grew up, there certainly was. It was seen about what was possible in our universe versus what wasn't, and whether it was more reflective and a metaphor for what we were doing or whether it was more wide open creative. But do those distinctions really matter?
Yeah, so the sort of omnibus phrase would be kind of speculative fiction that would encompass both science fiction and fantasy, and there are plenty of people who are interested in both and who like that phrase. The main kind of lines of distinction would be science fiction would would tend to be more focused on things that are actually possible within the kind of laws of physics as we understand them, and that maintain a sort of very consistent set of rules within the universe as to how the particular created universe works. Whereas there's a much greater play for things like magic and the supernatural in fantasy, which for people who like science fiction kind of rules fantasy out of being a particularly useful way to comment upon society. I mean, I like both. I think they're both useful. You do have to be kind of cognizant of the differences and just be cognizant of how you're using the worlds that you are using. There is an argument that fantasy can be somewhat regressive or kind of small c conservative, largely because it's often set in the past. The focus on magic kind of reduces the degree to which ordinary people can kind of set their own destiny. And so people become kind of subjects more than agents of their own fates. And it tends to deal a lot with kind of castles and princesses and nobilities and again, things that maybe reduce the agency of ordinary people. So, there is that to be cognizant of. But I like both. I probably do lean towards science fiction a little more than fantasy, though.
I remember as a teenager, reading as much science fiction and fantasy as I could, and hearing that distinction, right? Science fiction is about the laws of physics, the way we understand them. Even if technology is advanced, it's consistent with our understanding of how the world works. And then you go tell a story, as opposed to fantasy, which is you just make shit up, right? You can do magic, you can do anti-gravity is in science fiction. So I guess part of that is my question that I remember even as a teenager thinking, well, if the way that they can have all these galactic explorations is by pressing the faster than light button, at least what I learned in junior high school physics was that travel faster than the speed of light kind of doesn't make sense. And it's just a device in science fiction to say, yeah, we've solved that. Well, how is that any different than magic, right? Going back to Arthur C. Clarke, how is that any different from magic? And does science fiction and fantasy kind of break down whenever you take those liberties?
Yeah, that is a point that would be made by a person who wanted to work in both fantasy and science fiction, or who wanted to kind of rescue fantasy from being dismissed as just magic and nonsense by people who talk about science fiction. I mean, what you really want is for the work of speculative fiction to have an effect upon the reader so that the reader can see the connections between the created world and their own world. And there's a scholar of science fiction called Darko Suvin who calls this the cognition effect, right? You can see in the created world cognitively the links between that world and the real world. And it's that gives the created world the ability to say important things politically or socially or whatever about the real world. And if you wanted to dismiss fantasy, you would say the cognition effect is destroyed by the introduction of impossibilities, such as magic or like the Force in Star Wars is a classic example that for some people rules Star Wars out of being science fiction and puts it in the fantasy realm. But there are those who work in fantasy who say the cognition effect is just a convincing literary strategy. And you can be convincing in the way that you present magical interventions. And that world, as long as it's sort of internally consistent, can still have important things to say about our own world.
I'm interested in speaking with you about this in the context of international relations, right? My field of study, and you've looked at various aspects of political science, but focused on international relations in your book, Otherworldly Politics, where you explicitly look at what the study of international relations tells us about Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Battlestar Galactica, and the reverse, what those can teach us about it. But I don't want to limit it necessarily to those, because I think there are some broader themes here that may just come up as we chat. But I do want to go back half a step, because you weren't always the guy who was combining international relations and political science with the study of speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy. I think you'd said that it goes back a little bit more than 10 years, though, when it became more explicit, when you were teaching in, of all places, China. What happened when you were there, and how did that really crystallize your interest in looking at this intersection?
Yes, I used to be a very respectable and serious political scientist, and then then walked off this cliff into into science fiction. So what happened was I was invited to go teach in China over the summer, and this actually ended up being kind of a 4-summer long thing. And I'd go out for 6 to 8 weeks and would teach Chinese national undergrads. I mean, the Wrinkleworthies were all people who were enrolled in American kind of 4-year degree programs, and they wanted to take summer school and have the credits kind of count towards their American degrees. But simultaneously, they, of course, wanted to go home and see their family and friends and so forth back in China. And the problem they had was that summer courses taken at Chinese universities were not necessarily going to transfer credit-wise to American universities. And so I started working for this company that hit upon the, in retrospect, genius idea of just shipping out a plane load of US-based professors to work at Chinese universities and kind of offer this summer school. And it was this just most incredible experience. I mean, I'd never been to China before. I ended up going to Beijing twice, Nanjing, Shanghai. So I had a particular view of China. You know, these are kind of coastal major metropolitan cities, but still was completely different than anything I'd ever come across in the past. Absolutely amazing kind of life expanding experience. More specifically, what happened was I got in the classroom and I started teaching Introduction to International Politics, which, you know, every IR professor will tell you is the class that you just teach every year of your life, to the point that you sort of go insane because you're like, didn't I just talk about Woodrow Wilson like last week? And it was actually a semester ago. And you know, you kind of know these lectures off by heart because you're just teaching it again and again. And I started doing my same old, what you might uncharitably call bullshit, out in China, and it just wasn't having the normal effect. And I was being met with kind of blank faces and stares of incomprehension. And it was nothing at all to do with language skills. I mean, my Chinese skills were zero, but my students' English skills were absolutely superb. So that wasn't the barrier. It wasn't a linguistic barrier. The problem that we had was, first of all, international relations is, although it works on quite simple ideas, it actually uses quite a confusing and complex set of terminology and quite a sort of discipline-specific terminology. You know, you talk about neorealism in international relations, and that means one thing. Where you go down one floor to film and media studies, and neorealism is something else entirely. So even students within the same national context get kind of tripped up by this kind of terminology, and also the sort of received view of history in China and the United States is not the same. And if you want to explain Woodrow Wilson as an idealist and tell the story of the First World War and after, as I was doing from a Western-centric lens, you did not have the same reading of those events and the same historical background as Chinese students did, even if you were working with undergrads who knew a lot of history, which is not universally the case. And so I kind of pondered this problem, you know, how am I going to communicate these ideas of international relations in this different cultural context? And I was walking around the city and I saw young Chinese people wearing T-shirts saying things like House Stark or House Lannister. And, you know, it turns out that Game of Thrones was really big in China at the time for some, you know, pretty understandable cultural reasons, right? If you watch any Chinese television channel, you're presented with dragons and castles being stormed and dynastic struggles and so forth. And so Game of Thrones just seemed like a spectacularly well-produced version of some actually quite familiar cultural tropes and modes of storytelling. And so the next time I went back to China, I started using examples that I'd drawn from speculative fiction more broadly. I mean, Game of Thrones, because I was trying to meet the students where they were at, and it was currently the most popular show, but also Star Trek and Battlestar, Galactica and Star Wars and some of these other texts. And that was a lot more successful because you could kind of short circuit this differential understanding of history and the terminology as well was a lot easier to get around when you were not talking about mutually assured destruction and weapons of mass destruction, but you could say, hey, Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, like they're really powerful, aren't they? Let me tell you about the strategic logic there.
Well, there's one thing related to this that I will bring up and then I will dismiss because we can't talk about it in any depth without massive spoilers. And even though it's not new, the novel The Three-Body Problem and its sequels, Chinese science fiction, remarkable book. And I had, for some reason, just not gotten to it for many years. And I recently picked it up and just couldn't stop. I found it to be really eye-opening in some important ways. You've actually done some academic analysis of it and related it to some issues of international relations, but I don't want to give it away because I don't want to take away that joy that I had recently discovering it. I don't feel the same way about Star Trek, the original series, because that's been around longer than I've been alive. And even the Star Wars movies, I think we're pretty safe getting into now and giving away some spoilers about some of the things that happen. So let's focus.
Can we say who Luke's father is? Do you think that's
Oh,
safe?
yes, but was his mother actually Taylor Swift?
You get a
That I
good
don't
point.
know.
Watch the Yukon Popcast episode on Taylor Swift
There you go.
and find out.
Yeah. So let's jump in first with the themes, and then we'll apply Star Trek and perhaps Star Wars and others to this. But how can science fiction and fantasy help us understand international relations? What are the ways in which focusing on these actually does help you do that?
Yeah, so I think there's several ways. One way is just a basic sort of engagement of people's interest, and that's sort of the basic barrier that people have to cross to understand anything, is to be interested in it. And this is something that's always foremost in my mind as a teacher, because you can't teach students anything if they're just not engaged. And so there's kind of a vivification of the source material, I think, is very, very important. I think another way that science fiction and fantasy can help us in understanding international relations is by kind of clarifying some of the underlying relationships that are going on in particular historical episodes or in theories of international politics. You tend in storytelling on screen to get a sort of privileged view at the way that decision makers are making decisions in a way that you often don't in the real world. Vladimir Putin is not going to tell us exactly why he invaded Ukraine. He'll give us this mixture of rhetoric and maybe there's some truth in there somewhere, and a bunch of disinformation as well.
Maybe some post hoc justification because he didn't have an exact reason and calculus laid out. I think there's this, especially in political science, we tend to have this belief that we are able to determine someone's exact motives. And the more you study psychology, the more you realize, no, a lot of us make up the reasons after we've decided what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Or we're just completely, all the reasoning is done kind of pre-consciously and emotionally. And then your brain comes up with some sort of explanation. You think, well, that sounds sensible. That must have been why I did it. Whereas in sort of narrated stories or in science fiction and fantasy, the whole point is to take you deep into the true motivations and the true decision making of the protagonists. So that I think is a very, very important kind of benefit that this way of working can give to us. You can also touch kind of hot button issues, and this has been a classic role that science fiction in particular has played in American culture and in other cultures, is to put on screen uncomfortable truths or moral dilemmas that are very, very difficult to tackle head on, and that would be kind of politically controversial. I mean, there are, maybe we'll get into it later, but there are plot lines in Battlestar Galactica in which the people who are representing the Americans adopt suicide bombing as a method of resisting overwhelming force. And certainly at the time, certainly 15, 20 years ago when Battlestar Galactica was on screen, it would have been hard in a classroom, let alone on network television, to kind of entertain the thought that Americans would do such a thing, or to try and see the world from the standpoint of a kind of suicide bomber. But when you call people the colonials and the other side of the Cylons and it's all set in space, well, you can have actually a much deeper and richer understanding or accounting of what might be going on there. So there are at least some of the ways in which science fiction and fantasy can help us here.
Well, I do want to get to some Battlestar Galactica because it is such a remarkable. And let's be clear, we're talking about the more recent TV series, not the first one. And I have not seen, what was the follow-on? Caprica? Was that the name of the?
Yeah, Caprica was not as compelling. I didn't think. It was like a follow-on, but in universe, like a prequel. Although maybe it would be more compelling now because it was about the kind of crossover point where artificial intelligence becomes sentient and kind of takes over the world. So maybe we should all rewatch that to see what the next 10 years is going to be like.
I have it well down on my list, but now you're making me think I need to move it farther up the list, still ahead of Taylor Swift, but on the list nonetheless. But we're talking about the BSG that's more recent, not the one with, oh gosh, who was in that? Dirk Benedict and
Yeah, Richard Hatch. Well, Richard
Richard
Hatch,
Hat.
who played
Yeah,
Apollo, was in both.
that's
Because he
right.
played, he was the lead, one of the leads in the original, the kind of '70s one, and then he played Tom Zarek, who was this kind of Marxist revolutionary in the reboot.
Yeah. So we hopefully we'll get there. But I do want to start with Star Trek, both because it temporally it makes sense to start with something that was in the 1960s on television, and primarily talk about the original series, although I want to get into the next generation and some of the films a bit as well. But let's go back to the world building part first of all. So Star Trek, watching the first few episodes, you get that there is a federation of planets. It's pretty obvious that there's humans from Earth, presumably, and there are Vulcans who are remarkably human-like. Just some slightly different features due to the budgets at the time, probably more than anything else. Now, it's a federation of planets. Later on, as episodes go on, you learn about many other species, but early on, you don't know how many there are. You just know that there is some kind of governance structure that is beyond Earth. But what else do we really know about the Federation of Planets and where the power centers are, and how all of the things we study in political science, from domestic politics to international relations, well, how they play out in the Star Trek universe based on the original series?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and the answer, I think, even at the time of the inception of Star Trek, would depend upon who you asked. I mean, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and he was, by the way, absolutely insistent that he be referred to as the creator, like in capital letters and so on. A little bit of an ego there, apparently. But he had a very defined idea for what the Star Trek universe was, and I mean, throughout his life, actually increasingly so as he got older, he saw this universe as a evolved, idealistic universe, and the Federation as a non-militaristic kind of exploratory, science and exploration and diplomacy based organization. And that was Roddenberry's vision for Star Trek, and his sort of premise, his world building premise, was that humans would have improved just over the course of history. You know, that we were on a certain trajectory when Roddenberry was alive, and maybe some of the best values in humanity were kind of expressed by the best of the United States, you know, in its own self conception as kind of the leading light for freedom and so forth. And humanity would over time kind of evolve beyond the distinction between people who live in different nations, and would kind of come under a one world government. And then the logical thing to do after that would be to start exploring other nearby worlds. And then, of course, these essentially American ideas, you know, democracy and, the way that you kind of take your values out into the universe would be universally appealing to people of all different civilizations, or most people of all different civilizations, and they would essentially federate themselves into a structure that was somewhere between the United States and the United Nations, just on a kind of galactic scale. And I think that was the analogy that Roddenberry was operating on, at least as regards the kind of governance and politics of the Federation itself.
And when we think about that, Stephen, that has some truthiness to it. Like, it seems like, well, yeah. If you're technologically advanced enough that you're able to get between star systems in a reasonable time frame, that you're probably advanced enough that you haven't blown yourself up, which implies some kind of coordination and cooperation above the level that Homo sapiens have been at for most of their history. So I guess that sounds right, but that's not the only way that science fiction creators have conceived it. I mean, you had some of Arthur C. Clarke's novels where it was a very competitive environment, right? Up to and including, I think, 2001, with, you know, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans all exploring into space instead of consolidating into a federation, even on Earth first. We've already mentioned the three-body problem, where there's a very different take about trying to reach out to communicate with others in the galaxy. and different countries were doing very different, very secretive approaches to it. So it need not be Roddenberry's vision, even though that's probably the easiest, right? As a set foundation for a series is, yeah, we've kind of resolved all that. So I don't have to tell stories about Earth politics, but I can use all the stuff these guys, and they were mostly guys, are going to do in space to really retell those stories of everything from, World War II to realism versus idealism and all of these other issues.
Well, that's it. And although that was Roddenberry's idea for the Federation, he and the people he worked with, and I think it's important to acknowledge that the world building process in Star Trek was Roddenberry has the idea, but many of the episodes were written by other writers, and this would be a constant kind of source of tension that Roddenberry would want the stories to be one way, and writers would bring in other stories that very often had very different views of how things would work, not only in space, but very different kind of reflected views on what the United States was at the time. So that kind of a lot of the conflict and difference in the Star Trek universe was brought in by people other than Roddenberry. But even Roddenberry himself acknowledged that you couldn't really have a TV show that was just about these perfect humans who went out into space. I mean, what's the dramatic arc every week? Hey, hello, aliens from another world. We're America. It's great. Do you want to be our friend? Cool. All right, that's that then. I mean, that would be kind of a dull kind of TV series. Although Roddenberry did try that with the first season of the Next Generation, which had predictable results. But in the Star Trek universe, you had these other powers that represented different kind of political forms and allowed for conflict with the Federation. Most famously the Klingons and the Romulans. Which actually gave you a fairly precise analogy of the Cold War kind of international system circa the 60s and the 70s, if you assumed that the Klingons were supposed to be a rough analog of the Soviet Union and the Romulans in some sense a rough analog of the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Now, later on, there have been the people, including officially sanctioned things within the Star Trek universe that have, had the ultimate guide where they have maps of territories of the Klingons versus the Romulans versus Cardassians and others eventually. But at the time of the original series, you didn't have that, right? The first few episodes, there weren't Klingons, there weren't Romulans very early on. And you didn't really have a sense of it. And so what we had was the USS Enterprise, clearly modeled on Navy. And like you said, it was science and exploration. The voiceover at the beginning is all about brave new worlds and going and exploring things. But yet it's pretty clear pretty quickly on that these are warships, that they have some pretty awesome weapons and they are meant for fighting. And that's a weird contrast there at the beginning, is they're out there in the universe exploring. Seemingly things are relatively peaceful. That is, it's not an active war zone every time they're traveling. And yet they're in a no-kidding warship that's able to blow things out of space relatively easily, given the right opponent. That's a weird contrast. And what it led me to think when I was first watching Star Trek many, many years ago is I really don't understand the international order as it applies to space. So I guess the interplanetary order. Is it unipolarity because the Federation is the dominant power and there are just these things adjacent that are kind of like the Romans picking off what they called barbarians around the borders? Or is it bipolarity because the Klingons are in fact a massive empire and they're just barely crossing over spheres of influence? Are we led to believe that with the Romulans it's or is it multipolarity with others? How do you envision if you will, the international system, the interplanetary system of the Federation and its opponents, especially in the original series?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you do have to. The way you put that's very interesting. Do you view it as you experienced it maybe on the first time you watched the show, or do you kind of retcon it all given given what with all the material that's come out later? I think the truth of the from the production side is I don't think they knew either. And we have to remember that this was an era of television in which none of these plot lines had to be linked together, because the point of a TV show was once it gets in syndication, any episode can be shown in any order. And so you really have to have something that neatly kind of disassembles itself at the end of every week. So no real long-term arc can be sustained. I mean, that is a a much more recent phenomena, dating from basically the era of kind of prestige television. And that's maybe where Battlestar Galactica is so distinctive from Star Trek. In Battlestar Galactica, like you can't watch the episodes out of order. I think so that I think is the production truth. I think in terms of using Star Trek as a way to think about international politics, I think the most useful way to think about it is as essentially a bipolar or a 2.5 pole system, with the Federation and the Klingons, the Romulans as kind of a lesser but still significant power. And one of the most telling and incisive kind of episodes that dealt with this theme in Star Trek is the episode where they meet the Organians, who are these kind of super powerful, kind of godlike figures. What kind of happens is Kirk and crew kind of happen upon a place that is being sort of subjected to domination by the Klingons, and of course they're the Klingons, right? So they're undemocratic and they're repressive, and we, the Federation, are going to go down there, and what do we do to small places that are being subjected to terrible Klingon domination? We liberate them, and we welcome them into the world of democracy and freedom. And so kind of Kirk and Spock go down to the planet, and they start saying to the citizens, shouldn't you be fighting the Klingons? Shouldn't you kind of raise up an army and get rid of this occupying force, and we'll help you? And they say, no, we're not really that bothered. And the Klingons are objectively horrible to them, and like we don't really care. They're very sort of zen about what's going on. And it turns out that the whole thing is actually being orchestrated by these kind of supernatural or super powerful figures, the Organians, who say, what is really going on here, Kirk, Spock, is your Federation is no different than the Klingons, and you model yourselves as kind of paragons of democracy and people who are bringing liberation to this place. But you're actually just engaged in a kind of power politics game with the Klingons, because you're both basically superpowers. And this is very analogous to, I mentioned neorealism earlier, to the theory of international politics called neorealism, which was sort of a later wrinkle on traditional power politics that argued that everyone just behaves the way they do in international politics because of their structural position kind of vis-a-vis one another. And you are going to behave in a specific way if you're a superpower, regardless of whether you're a democracy or a dictatorship or communist or capitalist, or in this case, Federation or Romulans. And so the Organians say to Kirk, you're the same as the Klingons, and Kirk says, no, we're democratic. And the Organians say that makes no difference. You're just kind of acting out this kind of superpower role. And even more presciently, in some period of time, you and the Klingons will be friends. I mean, these roles are not forever. These structural power positions are not forever. And that is, of course, what happened both in this fictional Star Trek world and in our real world. Well, at least for a bit. I don't know. The United States and Russia are not really friends. There's been some backsliding there, but
that's a very interesting episode, because even as, and I have no idea what age I was when I saw it, but watching Star Trek in syndication, because TV was very different, at least when I grew up, than it is now. Syndication was everything. And I remember shows that I'm assuming most of them were in syndication. Maybe some of them were actually still producing episodes, but you could find them all over the place on the various channels you could get at various times a day. And it was things like MASH and Star Trek were the big ones, but there were others. And I remember seeing this episode, and even at that relatively young age, thinking, this is not subtle, right? The Klingons are the Russians. The Klingons are the evil empire, Warsaw Pact, and they're brutal and they're oppressive, and they don't allow freedom of choice, and they're imposing their will. And the Federation is like so clearly America. And kind of a slap across the face in that episode when what turn out to be the Organians do say, yeah, you're basically just doing the same thing out there colonizing, the galaxy. That was rough. Star Trek was known for that. Star Trek, did a lot of social commentary and political commentary with only the thinnest veneer of science fiction to it. I mean, the most dramatic one that isn't as much international. And I think this is one I always forget the title of the episode, but something about let this be your last battlefield, or let that be your last battlefield, where they encounter the planet where some of the people are black on one half of their face and white on the other half, and others vice versa. and they're in conflict. And of course, the Federation comes in and says, "What's wrong with you? Why are you fighting over this? This is not a significant difference." It's like, well, you couldn't make it much more clear for audiences in the 1960s, could you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's true. And it was not subtle, which is really remarkable because we have to remember how sort of conservative American television culture was in those days. And this goes back to one of the benefits that speculative fiction has always had, which is the ability to sort of evade either explicit or implicit censorship in terms of saying difficult things for those in power to hear. And I was stunned when I was researching the original production of Star Trek, and this really indicates how conservative kind of television culture was at the time, to find out that one of the major dramas they had in even getting the first episode on screen had to do with Spock. And Spock had pointed ears. And the message came back from some of the networks, particularly in more conservative parts of America. Well, that's a devil then. And we're not putting a devil on the television because, good Christians will find this offensive. And this, of course, was tied up not just with morality, but with kind of making money. The problem is if people find these things offensive, advertisers would pull their money out of the show. And you kind of wouldn't have the money to sustain the thing. And it was a pretty close run call whether Spock could actually have his pointed ears because of this kind of devilish, suspected overtone to his character. And so set in that context, to be able to have absolutely on the nose critiques of the behavior of superpowers in other episodes, the Vietnam War, race relations, as you mentioned, to be able to do that in the context of 60s network television culture was really a remarkable achievement for science fiction. Of course, all of these things, we wouldn't think twice nowadays about a critique of American foreign policy, thinly veiled, being put on television. I mean, so I'm sure conservatives would argue that is the entirety of American popular culture nowadays. But it really was a remarkable thing in that context.
Mm-hmm. There's another episode that you've written about as highlighting the contrast between the fundamental schools of thought on international relations and human nature in many ways, realism and idealism. And that was the episode City on the Edge of Forever, which is a remarkable episode, even for people who aren't into science fiction. It's a brilliant, relatively short examination of some very deep issues. Briefly describe the episode and then do that overlay onto realism and idealism and how it points out that rough dilemma that policymakers actually have in executing what they believe to be an ethical foreign policy.
Yeah, so City on the Edge of Forever, kind of the setup is the Enterprise finds this, I don't know what you would call it, entity, portal called the Guardian of Forever. I mean, it's essentially just some rocks with some kind of multicolored special effects in the center.
A portal of some kind.
Yes, exactly. That kind of time travels you to different points in space and time, and through a series of, I guess the phrase is a series of unfortunate events, the Enterprise crew finds themselves back in kind of 1932, 1933 America, in Depression era America, prior to the Second World War. And one of the Enterprise crew members is kind of taken in by this Good Samaritan called Edith Keeler. And this crew member is kind of disoriented and needs help. And he's from the 23rd century. He's a bit surprised. So he needs some kind of orientation. And Edith Keeler helps him. And she's this kind of lovely woman. And she's a pacifist. And she believes the best in people. And she's, what you would call in international relations terms, or maybe just philosophical terms, an idealist. Through this series of events, history is altered so that Edith Keeler, who in our real world, or I mean, this gets actually quite confusing. In our real world, as it's extrapolated to the 23rd century world of the Federation, Edith Keeler dies kind of shortly after encountering this Enterprise crew member. But during the course of events in the episode, history has changed, so Edith Keeler survives, and she's such a kind of profoundly persuasive and good person that she rises in American society through the intervening years, to the point where she has a very important role kind of advising Franklin Roosevelt. And she sort of convinces Franklin Roosevelt that kind of war is not the answer, that a pacifist approach to the rising terrors that would culminate in the Second World War was the right approach. And in this kind of altered timeline, Hitler and the other kind of repressive regimes are not successfully defeated, and so you never have the good future of the USS Enterprise and the Federation. What has to happen in the episode, it turns out, is Edith Keeler must die almost directly at the hands of Kirk, or at least by an act of non-intervention by Kirk, who it so happens falls in. I mean, this is James Kirk. He kind of falls in love with her in the 5 minutes that's kind of dedicated to that subplot in the
Oh, Jim.
in the show.
Yeah.
With his winsome ways, he kind of wins her over, and he has to allow her to die in order for the kind of desperately bad future that's been created by the alternate timeline to be averted, and to really revert history to the good timeline where Kirk and Spock and McCoy, the Enterprise crew members, can go back to the Enterprise, and we have a history where Hitler was defeated and the Federation was brought into being. And what this really dramatizes, I think, in international relations terms, is kind of the oldest battle in thinking in schools of thought about international politics between idealists and realists. Idealists who would say, look, if you just act in not necessarily pacifistic, but in non-militaristic, diplomacy-oriented ways, if you just assume the best of people, you'll get the best outcome. And conversely, if you're suspicious of people and you do things like build up your armies and form secret alliances and form international alliances, if you do these things, you will provoke the worst in people. And that's kind of the idealist viewpoint. And Edith Keeler is kind of representing that in this Star Trek episode. The realist viewpoint is that is in all but very circumscribed areas of life, a hopelessly naive way to think about life, politics, really anything. And what happens if you act in idealistic ways is that you simply get trampled by bullies, and there's no one to stand up to bullies. And an idealist approach to the Second World War would be an approach that did not bring the United States into the war and would have led to an absolutely catastrophic outcome. So realists think idealists are good people and they have the right kind of goals, which are goals of peace and so forth, but they're just profoundly deluded about the means that are necessary to achieve good ends. And the most realist thing of all is doing dirty or morally bad things in the service of good ends. And so when Kirk allows Edith Keeler to be killed in this episode, Kirk is acting as a realist. He's doing something that is locally immoral, allowing the death of, a fantastic human being. But Kirk is doing it for the greater good, which is what realists always say when they're accused of being kind of dirty proponents of power politics. We're not the dirty ones. We are the sensible ones who, by our actions, ensure the best possible long-term outcome. Although we are still dealing with humans, and so the best possible long-term outcome is not going to be an ideal long-term outcome.
It really is the manifestation of that phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You can be trying to do the right thing. You can believe in what, in this case, you might even believe in what Edith Keeler was saying and wanting that to be the world. But trying to make that happen actually enables Adolf Hitler to win and subject the world to a global dictatorship. And that ain't so good.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And I think that's a very effective episode, and it's fairly clear where the writers of that episode come down on that dilemma, that they're realists. I think if I was to critique kind of the book I wrote and the way that I use science fiction in the book, I would say that those are uses of science fiction that we would characterize as kind of problem-solving uses of theory or of fiction in this case. You're faced with a desperately evil dictator, and what is the right thing to do? And the right answer is obviously to do what Kirk did, or it's to do what realists did. There is another function science fiction has, which is to imagine completely radically different worlds where there are just total revolutions in the nature of relationships between people. And I don't want to spoil anything, but as Three Body goes on, it maybe starts in that kind of problem solving mode, and maybe then goes to more distant or more radical places. And I think if I was to critique the book I wrote, I would say I did a lot of using types of science fiction to solve problems that are very similar to the problems that we have in our world. And I maybe didn't quite fully embrace the radical revolutionary possibilities that are offered by some forms of science fiction. But maybe I just need Otherworldly Politics, the sequel. If any publishers are listening and want to commission this, then this is maybe the chance.
You've done the right thing by, leaving yourself some more things to write about. So this is a good thing, right?
Yes.
The other aspect that Star Trek has done well, largely through, not exclusively, but largely through the character of Spock himself, is illustrating a lot of the promise and the risks of a fully rational choice theory approach to politics. So pretend I'm the undergrad in your intro course, give the 2-sentence introduction to rational choice theory, and then how everything from some of the original episodes like Mirror Mirror and the movies, including Wrath of Khan and others, play out some of these explorations of humans and Vulcans as rational actors and how that applies to politics.
Yeah, well, now you've mentioned Wrath of Khan, I'll be in tears in 5 minutes because there's a movie that ever since I saw it as a kid just has actually a physical effect on me, and I find it so emotionally taxing. And I realize there's kind of 98% of the audience are kind of guffawing at this point, but there's probably the 2% that's like, dude, I know, I cry too every time.
I gotta say, it hits me on both sides of that the same way that you and Jeff on the Popcast talked about, which is number one, I still remember vividly, and it strikes me every time I see it, even as a largely grown adult, when I saw it as a kid. And the scene with Chekhov on the planet at the beginning with the
the bug,
the symbiote,
the thing that goes in his ear, absolutely terrifying.
Ear, which scarred me for a long time with anything within miles of my ears. So there's the emotional reaction that still hits me there, but then the build up, the conclusion, the Spock at the end still gets me. I'm not going to lie, that still gets to me too. And I have to give credit to a lot of the choices made by the director, Nicholas Meyer, a previous guest of ours here on Chatter, even though my co-host Shane spoke with him much more about The Day After and the cultural importance of that made-for-TV movie in the 1980s. But Nicholas Meyer directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and if I recall, also Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and Star Trek VI.
So he kind of almost, yes, he kind of co-wrote. He co-wrote 4. Nimoy directed 4, and he did write 6, which incidentally, like 2 and 6 are the most. I am going to answer your rational choice question, by the way. I haven't forgotten. Yeah. 2 and 6 are the most, the most kind of politically astute of the movies. And Meyer, I think, I'd said that part of the Star Trek universe, or a lot of it, is Roddenberry's original vision, and part of it is the people that were brought in to write or to take in a different direction along the way. And Meyer, I would say, is the most important person who came into the Star Trek universe aside from Roddenberry. And Meyer just had a completely different view of what Star Trek was, to the point that Roddenberry was horrified by what Meyer was doing, and said, why are you turning the Enterprise into this unambiguous warship where people are giving orders, and why is this so brutal, and why are people dying, and this isn't my vision at all? And Meyer would say, yeah, but your vision has kind of run its course dramatically.
Better movies that way, and it's not just you and me saying that. The general consensus among Star Trek fans and critics is that the movies like 2, 4, and 6, if not the 3 best across all Star Trek movies, are definitely 3 of the top 4 or 5.
Yeah, and I mean the key to Meyer, maybe he said this to you, I don't know, but the key to Meyer, as I understand it, is 1, he didn't like Star Trek. He thought it was ridiculous. 2, what he really wanted to do was make a movie of Moby Dick when he got the control of kind of Wrath of Khan, but no one would kind of finance that. And that's really how Meyer kind of gets into Star Trek and is so successful. Anyway, that was a diversion, an irrational diversion, we might say.
It was, but a good one. But yes, rational choice theory. What is it, and how does Star Trek play it out there?
Yeah, rational choice theory. So rational choice theory is a model of human decision-making that we can contrast to the two we've been talking about. Idealism, people are good. Realism, people are essentially kind of power-oriented or selfish, bad in some ways, if you want to be kind of simplistic about it. Rational choice theory says people are neither. People are just kind of self-interested. And the best way to think about what a person is a person is just a calculator. And they will behave in a way that makes the sums add up for them to get the thing that they want. And this made rational choice theory extremely popular and portable across many areas of life, and certainly the academy, including psychology, economics, and political science and international relations, because the thing that people were said to want and were said to kind of rationally make choices towards could change depending upon what puzzle you were trying to explain. So in economics, the thing that people want is to kind of maximize the value of the way they're using their money. Or maybe if you're a firm, you want to maximize your profit or your market share. In international politics, the thing that you're often said to be trying to maximize is power or security. There are different variants, but it could also be kind of the health of your economy comparatively. So that's rational choice theory. People are calculators. There's essentially no difference between people. They all given the same situation will make the same decision, which is to maximize their interests, which made it...
Even if they're not, it's a useful theory to predict their behavior, to assume that they are, right? So it's not just like the caricature of neorealism is that, Kenneth Waltz said that all states are black boxes. No, he clearly did not say all states are truly black boxes, that their internal systems are the same. He said, for the purpose of predictive theory, if you assume certain things about the system, you can get a whole lot of purchase on international relations. Rational choice the same way. It's not stating that everybody maximizes utility at all times, but it's a useful theory for predicting behavior.
Yes, I agree with you. There is, I think, a split amongst political scientists between some who take theory as being kind of literal descriptions of the way things are, and some who take them as kind of useful ways to think about things. I sort of agree with the way you presented Waltz there. And that was one reason why I find science fiction to be such a useful guide to international relations that I'm not sure I mentioned in the past, which is what science fiction does is it doesn't say the world literally is this. We don't literally have spaceships. It says, imagine a world in which these things existed that was set up in this way. What can you now deduce about the world of your experience? And I would say international relations theory at its best is doing the same thing. Like Waltz said, imagine a world of essentially rational actors who will behave in broadly the same way, depending upon the situation that they face, or differences in behavior will be determined by differences not in their internal composition, but in the situations that they face. I'm not saying that's literally true. I'm saying, what can we now say that's useful about the world? And you could say a lot of useful things from neorealism. So how did this play out in Star Trek? You mentioned a couple of, an episode and a movie, and I think let's talk briefly about both. So Mirror Mirror, the episode of the original series, is a very classic demonstration of idealism, realism, and rational choice theory. So in Mirror Mirror, there is, again, a series of unfortunate events. I'm sure it was described somewhat differently on the in the production notes, but let's call it that. That leads to an accident in the transporter system, which would kind of teleport people from one place to another, from the ship to the planet. And weird stuff happens, screen goes funny, and Kirk and the landing party kind of step off the transporter, and the Enterprise is all different, and people are wearing kind of funky uniforms, and they give these kind of sort of Nazi-esque salutes. And, simultaneously, a different Kirk, a much kind of meaner Kirk, and other members of his landing party step out of the transporter pod, and they're on the Enterprise we know. And what's happened is a kind of, I guess what you now call a multiverse has occurred. And good Kirk has gone to the mirror universe, where the Federation is bad, is essentially built on kind of brutalist principles, not the sort of idealist principles that we were used to seeing. And people sort of advance up the chain of command by killing their superiors, and the Federation is not a kind of benevolent, diplomacy-oriented organization, but it's essentially a sort of rapacious, explicitly imperialist, organization. And Good Kirk's task in the bad universe is to, first of all, try and get back to the good universe. And second of all, try and sort of effect some change within this bad universe and get them back on what he would regard as a much more rational track. Incidentally, in the good universe, Bad Kirk is sort of instantly discovered because he's just behaving as this kind of barbarian. And amongst these super enlightened people, this stands out like a million miles and he gets put in the brig and that's that. But Good Kirk in the bad universe is sort of smart enough that he sort of plays along with the brutality and he can kind of pull the wool over people's eyes. And so, things ensue. And in the end, Kirk is able to kind of hatch a plan where he can kind of swap over with his counterpart and everything will be returned to normal. The interesting point that's made, and I think this is where rational choice theory comes in, is in both of these universes, Spock is not part of this landing party. And so there's no switch off Spocks. Bad Spock is still on the bad Enterprise. Good Spock is still on the good Enterprise. I mean, the big difference is bad Spock has a goatee beard, which I guess denotes the ability to survive in harsh circumstances.
And
I don't know how that works.
The cultural meme that exists from this episode for people even outside Star Trek is the evil Spock with the goatee. But he's not really evil as such. He's definitely part of that environment and he operates within that environment and he's survived in it. But he's kind of stayed the same, logical person.
Because that's what rational choice says, right? It says that people don't actually differ in their fundamental goodness or fundamental badness, which is kind of the premise of the multiverse, a bad federation full of bad people, federation full of good people. Spock is rational in both universes. And so, as you say, he accommodates himself. I mean, he's not an idiot. He, acts in reasonable ways. But it also means that he is the person to whom Good Kirk can appeal, not to make change within the bad federation because it's the right thing to do, which is what an idealist would do. But Kirk appeals to Spock's rationalism. He recognizes that this is the tenor in which change is possible. And he says, look, Spock, I'm not going to talk about morality here, but it is irrational to have this kind of rapacious imperialism. Wouldn't the Federation get along better if it actually tried to make some friends and set up some kind of peaceable diplomatic and trading relations? He says, look, Spock, it's kind of ridiculous that the way that you get promoted is by killing off your superior. I mean, that sort of creates some inefficiencies around the office. And would it not be better if you, set up like an HR program and did some trainings and we're all kind of more reasonable and rational to one another? And Spock says, I kind of see the logic there and I'll consider it. And the episode does leave you with the impression that it will be rationalism that rescues the bad Federation from its badness, not an appeal to morality, because ultimately, like, being bad is irrational in that telling. Now, Wrath of Khan.
Yes.
Greatest on-screen representation of both the kind of strengths and the sort of hard limits of rationalism or utilitarianism. And this is something Meyer would do to Roddenberry's ideas again and again, which is he'd point out the wrinkles or the limit or the kind of other way of thinking about this kind of thing. So in Wrath of Khan, series of unfortunate events, turns out that the Enterprise is kind of trapped close to another starship, the starship of the antagonist, and the starship's going to self-destruct, and the Enterprise is like badly damaged and it can't get away in time. It's actually a fascinating moment in the life of James T. Kirk, because he is faced with, he's going to die. Like, he's lost. And this is the person who never loses, who never, as he says in the movie, who never faces death, who always cheats his way out of death. And I again, this is another one of the things about that really remarkable movie that always stayed with me, was they put that kind of indomitable character in the most vulnerable position, which is he had unambiguously lost. He was dead, and even worse, he had led everyone that he was supposed to be in charge of to their death as well through his inadequacies. Fortunately, though, he has this buddy, Mr. Spock. And Spock takes the decision that there are lots of people on the Enterprise, and I am one person. And it is rational for me to sacrifice myself by exposing myself to this kind of deadly dose of radiation down in the engineering room. in order that I can save the ship. And this, of course, is what happens. And Spock is the great hero, but he pays the ultimate price. I mean, he does die in the act of saving the ship. And in his sort of death throes, he explains to Kirk that what he had done was actually rational, and it was the only logical thing to do. You know, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, and that is absolutely rational. And in that sense, this is just a kind of fairly unreformed kind of Jeremy Bentham utilitarian calculation. But of course, if you watch the movie and you've seen the way it's played, that is not at all what is going on. You know, what is going on is Spock is hiding behind utilitarianism to explain, the love he has for his friends and his shipmates. And it's actually, for this man who had been regarded as a calculator. I almost said a human calculator. Of course, he's famously not human. Who had been portrayed as this kind of walking, unemotional calculator. It is him showing at the last that what we always knew, he is anything but that. And although the kind of sacrifice is explained in utilitarian terms, my reading anyway is that it has relatively little at that point to do with utilitarian. It's sort of an act of love and an act of friendship, an act of comradeship.
Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about Gene Roddenberry and his more, I guess, idealistic, progressive vision for what the future would be like. Even though in episodes that he himself at some level approved, there were some very blunt realist statements like The City on the Edge of Forever, which was not about this inherent idealism, everything's going to work out well. It was about tough choices. Things felt a little bit different for me in a series that I never got into as much as the original series, which is The Next Generation. It felt like there was a different vision that was, like all literature and culture, reflective of its times. Talk about how The Next Generation envisioned the, what you will, international relations or interplanetary relations, and what that reflected about the time in which it was made.
Yeah, so Star Trek goes off the screens, after 3 seasons, and there are these attempts to bring it back, and eventually one of these attempts is successful. In the late 1980s, I think Next Generation starts in 1987, and the Star Trek that comes back, the Next Generation, portrays a Federation 100 years after the events of the original series, and Roddenberry's influence is at least at this point quite clear, because this is a bigger, more expansive, more powerful, and even more evolved Federation than we'd seen in the original series. And that was kind of true to Roddenberry's logic, that humans were on this kind of teleological upward trajectory, and we might not be particularly good people in the 40s when Roddenberry fought in the Second World War, or the 60s when he made the original series. But by the 24th century, not even the 23rd century, we would have evolved to be much better. And so that's kind of the setup for the Next Generation. The other things that are going on is the Cold War's kind of coming to an end, and that's reflected in the Next Generation, in which the Klingons and the Federation are allies at this point. There's a Klingon officer who serves on the bridge of the Enterprise, kind of fulfilling the Organian's prophecy that you will become friends. Of course, reflecting, the events of a movie that we spoke about glancingly, Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, where the
Remind
Klingon
me,
Empire.
Stephen, do I remember right that in the early episodes of The Next Generation, there is no big bad, right? There is no Klingon Empire that's the other pole. Yes, there's Q and other amazing beings that have powers, but there's not like the existential struggle that eventually became part of the original series with the Klingon Empire.
Yeah, 100%. And this again was, Roddenberry died actually, fairly early in the run of Next Generation, but he did have a strong influence on the first season, and kind of consistent with his views. You're right, there was no big bad. There was no kind of primary antagonist. This seemed to be a kind of galaxy that was almost wholly dominated by the Federation. And I liken it in the book to ideas that were circulating at the time in international politics, to do with kind of globalization, the increasing interconnection of the world, which at that point was seen to be likely to be a technology-driven elimination of difference, that would lead to everyone being the same. You had people like Thomas Friedman writing articles about, I've been to McDonald's
The
branches
world
all
is
over the
flat.
world.
Yeah,
Yeah, the world is flat. I've been to McDonald's all over the world, and everywhere seems the same to me. And no countries that have McDonald's have ever fought wars with one another. Ipso dipso, the world is all the same, and no wars will ever be fought. I mean, it could just be he was maybe not exploring these various parts of the world with quite the diligence that you might hope. Francis Fukuyama is at this point working on what would become his, uber famous end of history article and then book, arguing that, ideological contestation had essentially ended in the late 1980s, and the future would be increasing homogenization, in terms of political forms, but also just basically ideologies. And that's what season 1 of Next Generation was like. It seemed to be a dramatization, essentially, of those ideas. It was also fantastically boring. I mean, largely for those for those reasons. That there were no real antagonists, and the writers would recount that they felt they'd been put in what they called the Roddenberry box. And the Roddenberry box is this kind of stricture, or structure and stricture that says you can't have any conflict because everyone's so evolved now, and there are no big antagonists. And people don't really vie for over money and ambition and petty power struggles. And the writers would say, this sounds like a lovely place to live, but how am I supposed to write whatever it was, 26 1-hour TV episodes? Yeah, what's the arc here? Like, someone's nice to someone else and then they all shake hands. I mean, that's kind of boring TV. This was boredom that, I mean, not to stretch this analogy too far, but boredom was something that Francis Fukuyama identified as being the major problem at the end of history. That history without ideological contestation is dull, and people will just lapse into sort of vapid, mindless consumerism. And Next Generation, I think, almost got cancelled. I mean, there was the famous attempt to introduce a new villain, which were called the Ferengi, which are kind of these 3-foot tall, humanoid figures. They're kind of giant ears. They sort of had these whips that they kind of, spun around above their heads, which did seem a bit sort of underwhelming when everyone else has ray guns. They just weren't a sort of threatening enemy. And so there had to actually be a fairly radical reset on Next Generation in order to rescue that show and interject some drama in rather the same way, although maybe this is a facile point to make, but it did become apparent as the 1990s went on that Friedman-esque, tension-free globalization, or Fukuyama-esque end of history was not our immediate future either, and we were, I'm afraid, in for a bumpier ride than maybe those two had envisaged.
Well, I tell you, the Next Generation did eventually get around to one of the better villains, I think, in TV science fiction, the Borg, which is the ultimate collective, right? The ultimate hive mind. So they did get there, but it was almost as if, I don't know if it was a conscious reaction to this feeling about the early episodes and the early lack of that kind of direct conflict driving things, or what it was. But that did get to an issue even more so than I think some of the original series episodes did, about the fundamental tension between political order of representation and freedom of choice, which we presume the Federation of Planets is a fully functioning democratic institution of some kind, versus the ultimate collective, where there is no true individual identity and everybody is centrally controlled for the collective good. They made that just as stark as some of those original series episodes were in terms of the conflict between the two.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with you. The Borg are one of the great enemies, certainly the great enemy of Next Generation, and sort of saved that series from absolute irrelevance, certainly from cancellation. And the really important thing about them was that they were so powerful. And, the Federation had been presented much in the same way as people thought about the United States during the kind of unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War, as having no enemies and just effortlessly swatting everyone aside. And Kenneth Waltz could have told you that that situation is inherently unstable and it will never last. And it didn't last in fiction either. And the Borg come along, and they are, as you say, kind of this terrifying hive mind, this sort of collectivizing force. And they also function as this really kind of Rorschach test kind of entity, in that people try and decode the Borg as representing very different things in our world, depending upon what their ideologies are. So for some people, the Borg are, well, it's clear they're communists, right? They're trying to like get rid of individual freedom and crush us all and make us conform. And that's one reading of the Borg. For other people, the Borg is clearly sort of capitalism and neoliberalism, and it's trying to homogenize everything and crush kind of individual difference. And so different people would draw analogies between the Borg and kind of our real world. But they definitely helped that show, because my goodness, it was going nowhere at first.
Well, I won't get into all of the other series that have been on since then, mostly because I have not seen most of the other series. But it's fair to say that some of the creators and writers, and probably some of the individual directors and actors and things, understood a lot of these issues and learned from the experiences of others, because there's been a lot more diversity of some of these themes in later Star Trek series. But I'll leave that for another day. But I do want to touch again on something we touched on earlier, which is Battlestar Galactica, the newer version, because it's some of the best television I've ever seen. Especially a few episodes really stand out to me. One you referred to earlier because of the suicide bombing and the fact of how it played out in that environment after 9/11 and the so-called global war on terror, with the episode. It was about occupation, and I have this memory that it was called Occupation or something like that, but a brilliant episode that got to some of these fundamental things, but they didn't do it in a facile way. And then the other one that I'd like you to speak about also is the episode 33, which is one of the most intense episodes of television I've ever watched. And I think my blood pressure is up just reflecting on watching that episode. The opposite of the original series of Star Trek, where there was not this existential conflict. It was, oh, let's go explore this planet, and we find this strange new flower that makes us dance, and we need to figure out how to get away from that, or who's Captain Kirk going to hit on this week. Instead, Battlestar Galactica, it is about, every episode is about existential survival, the survival of the human race itself on the line every week, and 33 made that explicit. Talk through those episodes in particular, but what they collectively say about Battlestar Galactica and how it represents a way of looking at our own politics.
Yeah, and you sort of alluded to that there is a link between kind of the later Star Treks and Battlestar Galactica, and that's Ronald D. Moore, who is the creator of Battlestar Galactica, who got his start as a staff writer on Next Generation, and then kind of took bigger roles in Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager, which were later series that became sort of more and more serialized, told longer stories and dealt with darker and darker themes. And those were elements of storytelling that Moore took to their zenith, I think, in Battlestar Galactica. The story of Battlestar Galactica, as I understand it, its kind of inception or its reboot is NBC was looking for a franchise to reboot, and they said, we got this Battlestar Galactica thing. And Ronald D. Moore was approached. And he said, well, I'll go and watch the old shows. And the old shows were sort of Star Wars ripoffs, at least aesthetically. And there was definitely an attempt to cash in on the popularity of Star Wars with Battlestar Galactica. But I'd always liked the old Battlestar Galactica. And I think not only because it was kind of shooty spaceships and so forth, but because it actually had quite a dark premise. It was just in the 70s, the original version, they hadn't quite paid off on the dark premise. And the very dark premise was, the story begins with an apocalypse, with the wiping out of all but a few tens of thousands of humans, the colonials, the stand-ins for humans. And Ronald D. Moore said he went and asked by NBC to look at this franchise, could it be revived? And he went and watched it in the aftermath of 9/11. And he said that this kind of darkness really hits differently now in this world where America is feeling kind of newly vulnerable, where there's great suspicion about things like infiltration into societies, where the thoughts of apocalypse are just much more on people's minds. And what if we did that premise in a very, it took it very seriously, in a very sort of serious way, and we said, what would society actually be like in the aftermath of an apocalypse, when there's just sort of 50,000 people left, when you are being kind of constantly hunted? And it wouldn't be like Star Trek. You wouldn't all be kind of patting yourself on your back on your backs about being moral and nice and all the rest of it. It would be a fairly sort of brutal fight for survival. And Moore took note of, or made use of, trends in television towards darker themes, more longer storytelling arc, kind of more prestige television sensibilities. And that's where Battlestar Galactica came from. It's kind of brought back on the screens in like 2003, and then runs from sort of 2004 to 2009. So the time period is post 9/11 right through the meat of the Iraq War. And all of these things are really, really prominent on screen. The first episode that you mentioned, Occupation. I mean, this was actually a sort of 4 or 5 part story arc, where the humans discover a planet where they think they might have safe refuge and they may be able to settle. By this point, it's sort of 3 seasons into the show, and they've just been on the run constantly from second one of the show starting. They've lost lots of people. It's they're all living on spaceships. It's cramped. It's dank. They're trying to keep elements of civilization together, but they're really struggling. There's tremendous resource shortages, and people just want somewhere to live. And so they find this planet, and it's not a paradise by any means, but it's sort of livable. And they also believe, due to kind of where it's located and the kind of atmospheric conditions in space around it, that it's pretty hidden, that they're probably not going to be discovered by the enemy that's pursuing them. And so they decide to settle on this planet, against the strong advice of the military leader, Adama, but on the orders of newly elected president, Gaius Baltar, which is a name that everyone knows from the original series, and you kind of knew which way his character was going to go. And so the humans kind of settle on this planet, and it turns out that it is not as hidden as they had hoped it was, and they're discovered relatively rapidly, and they don't now have the ability to disappear, to jump away in the argot of the show, because they're the ships are in orbit, the Battlestars, and everyone else is on the surface. So the warships have to leave behind the civilian population, which is essentially the 98% of the remnants of humanity, to be occupied by the Cylon enemy. And the Cylon enemy is a totalitarian and repressive structure. I mean, in some senses, actually, I'm saying that they're a little more terrifying than that, because they combine sort of totalitarianism with strains of somewhat alien ideas about social engineering and how humans really, really should live, and what would be good ways for their society to organize. And they leave Baltar in place as a kind of quisling, this is kind of a Vichy, I mean, to mix historical episodes here, kind of quisling figure. And it's sort of this horrible circumstance. And the humans on this planet, in desperation, resort to suicide bombing. There's a senior military officer is left behind on the planet, and he organizes a resistance, and part of this resistance is suicide bombing. And this causes tremendous sort of moral qualms amongst the human population. It basically destroys this military officer, Saul Tigh. It sort of breaks his spirit. He loses his wife in the course of events when she's revealed as a collaborator, and he essentially kills her, which again is this sort of dramatization of like wartime necessities, and extremely morally difficult situations. And it is, as you say, just a profoundly affecting dramatization of a sort of unimaginable situation. Really, just a remarkable series of television episodes. The geeky thing I'm going to say to you, because I know you've seen it, is that the most amazing thing I've ever seen on television is in a couple episodes on, when they try and mount the rescue mission, and they do you remember what I'm talking about? They jump the Galactica into the atmosphere, and it kind of it's not meant to be in an atmosphere. So it just falls like a rocket. I got up off my couch and I was like screaming, "What is happening?" Because you think this thing's going to crash. Absolutely incredible. Anyway, 33 very quickly. You also mentioned 33 is another episode, the first episode actually of once the show had been commissioned after its new pilot, the first episode of the regular run of the series, and 33 refers to the number of minutes separating the reappearance of the Cylon enemy. So basically what's happening in this episode is the fleet that has escaped the original apocalypse is jumping away using its faster than light drives, and after 33 minutes, the Cylons are reappearing and start attacking them again, and they have to immediately jump away, which is this huge puzzle because theoretically you're not supposed to be able to do that. Once you do this faster than light, it's supposed to be untraceable. So what is going on is a major problem. But also we join this series of events after about 4 days of this, and the people are exhausted, and so every 33 minutes they're having to perform this series of really complex kind of combat maneuvers, and no one can sleep. Certainly no one on the Galactica, the main kind of warship. And so they are all falling asleep, and they make mistakes. And one of the mistakes they make is that they, start to be sloppy in logging in which of the ships has successfully made the jump to the new rendezvous coordinates after 33 minutes. And it turns out they've lost a ship, the Olympic carrier, that has been left behind, and they don't really know why it's been left behind. And while all this is going on, the kind of pilots that fly the fighter planes are having to kind of take drugs to sort of stay awake. And there is an interesting production note. One of the actors, Jamie Bamber, would always tell the story that Edward James Olmos, who played Commander Adama, said during the production of 33 that, listen, guys, what we're going to do here is we're going to go method. And so we're not going to sleep. And he said, to make it really like pop on screen, you've got to actually genuinely be tired. And so none of us are going to sleep, guys, and we're going to go crazy, and it's going to get kind of trippy. And he says in the end, they kind of talked Edward James almost off the ledge there, but that was almost his original kind of plan, was we all literally will stay up for 4 days to shoot
It's funny you say that, because I had not heard that story, but my reflections of the episode are that, okay, that must be what they've done, because somehow, whether they each individually did that to some degree, it definitely gave the impression of not just the human body wearing down, but the human spirit, just this crushing fatigue that was permeating the entire episode. Just really, really amazing representation on film.
Yeah, and when one of the things I do in the book is I kind of liken this to some crisis situations in the real world, and particularly some accounts that decision makers gave of things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which people like Robert McNamara reflected, later in his life on what that experience was like. And he was like, he would say, look, we were terrified and we were exhausted. And, he would be kind of presented by political scientists and others with this sort of game theory or rational choice model of what was going on. And they'd say, but McNamara, essentially, like, this was a game of chicken, wasn't it? And you won, and aren't you smart? And this is rational. And he would say, like, it wasn't a game and there were no chickens. Like, we literally thought the world could end. And the pressure was just unbelievable. And you could see it in Kennedy's face and everyone's face. And another kind of anecdote I have in the book is a Soviet submarine commander who was being sort of depth charged by American destroyers, trying to get him to surface. And the American destroyers were using, depth charges of kind of very small capacity. They were just intended essentially as warnings, like you must surface. But he didn't know that. He thought they were trying to sink him. He sort of lost his mind, according to his crew, and wanted to start launching attacks on the ships above, and would have massively escalated the situation, again, largely because of crisis dynamics. And in 33, anyway, the denouement is the Olympic carrier turns up, again, this seemingly lost ship. And right after the Olympic carrier turns up, the Cylons are right behind them. And the Olympic carrier kind of flies straight towards the ship and is kind of, giving off signals that it has sort of nuclear weapons on board. And it's supposed to be this kind of civilian airliner. And pilots have to take the decision to shoot it down. And they don't really know what's happened to the people on this essentially civilian airliner. There's supposed to be 300 people on there. Are they still on there? Have they been captured by the Cylons? What's going on? And they have to, shoot down a civilian airliner, which again, in the immediate aftermath of post 9/11, was not an unfamiliar story.
Yeah, what I think the show did well almost universally, with only a few speed bumps, was the thing that I think any good fiction does well, which is highlight ethical dilemmas and make you feel them. Some do that better than others. Battlestar Galactica did it extremely well, and some might say that the original Star Trek, although clunky at times, also did that on some fundamental issues at a time when I can't remember when MASH started, but MASH ended up doing that for some issues related to the Vietnam War and other things. But Star Trek, was really doing that in some important ways on issues ranging from race relations to Viet from the beginning. So I guess they do share that DNA as well as ultimately the DNA of Ronald Moore.
Yeah, I think so, and I think they are shows that it's good to kind of watch them together, to watch to watch kind of one after another. Very, very effective, and we've been talking about all their kind of intellectual virtues and so forth, but they're just damn good television as well, right?
Well, I do want to talk just briefly before we close on something we'll give short shrift to, but something I have always been curious about. And I'm not talking about the retconned user guides and these books that you can find hundreds of now in bookstores that are describing the universe, but the Star Wars universe. As a political scientist and as someone interested in international relations, the Star Wars universe just made me scratch my head, because in the original movies, episode 4, 5, 6, you learn that there kind of is and then quickly was the Galactic Senate, but it's not clear what they did and what powers they had. And then you have the evil emperor. You have somebody who's pulling all the strings galactically, plots within plots, but definitely the big bad. And they just kind of leave out kind of how you got there. There's a few lines thrown out there about how things used to be better, and you get the sense that these characters are fighting for some vague sense of freedom, but it's not clear, what political order they think is worth fighting and dying for, or whether they know something about the emperor that we don't know. It's just a classic fight of good versus bad. Now, with the prequels, we get a little bit more of the story, but even then, it's just a huge legislative chamber with a lot of bureaucrats and lawyers and assistants who get in the way of efficient policymaking, but you don't really get a sense of what brought all of these different species, probably thousands in that chamber, what brought them together. What is it, a majority vote? Is it a supermajority? Are there regional governments that do various things? I felt very confused by the different representations of interplanetary governance in Star Wars. And you've probably thought about it a whole lot more than I have. And I want you to help me feel better about the Star Wars universe.
I think I can help you feel better about being confused, because I think it's I think it is very, very confusing, again, with the limits that you put on it. If you say, look, all we know is what is put on screen in the original trilogy, how does this work? It's amazingly confusing. I mean, what does Vader do? There's clearly a couple of lines of authority in the Empire, one of which is sort of political, military, bureaucratic, administrative, but the other of which is sort of religio, mystical, culty. And where does Vader fit in that? I mean, he's clearly number 2 in the kind of culty stuff, but at times he's given orders by the military personnel, and at other times he seems to just order them around. He has no problem killing them. So clearly he's not subject to military discipline. So I think it's definitely kind of a confusing universe. I suppose that does have some beneficial effects, at least in dramatic terms, which is you're left to fill in a lot of that by your imagination. And this was, I think, Lucas's great genius, which is he just put a few things and illusions on screen, and you had to fill in the rest by yourself. And your imagination is always a more compelling storyteller than someone else being forced to actually write things down. And of course, rather famously, Star Wars begins with episode 4, right? So you are led to believe that you are picking up a story halfway through, which gives it this kind of great propulsive quality. But it does mean that you do think, well, what happened in the first 3 that determined this kind of system of government? And wait, where do the X-Wings come from? And who's building them? And there's an academy, but does the Rebel Alliance have their own academy? And aren't they being hunted? So wouldn't they just like bomb this academy? And it is a sort of very confusing set of structures. I often go through this exercise with my class where we explore this, and I try to give them kind of a few different readings as to what the politics of this universe might be. And I start by saying that Lucas was very interested in the analogy between the United States and the analogy between the United States and the Empire during the period of Vietnam. And of course, he was thinking about Star Wars kind of towards the tail end of the Vietnam War. And he made comments at the time saying things like the United States will be the Empire in 10 years' time. And he was sort of taken by an analogy between Nixon and the Emperor and so forth. And so the sort of that reading. There are also readings of Star Wars from a more conservative side that the Empire is really what they're trying to do is sort of provide some order and some law. And if you sort of flip it in that way, I know we're supposed to see the Rebel Alliance as the good guys and the Empire as the bad guys. But if you do the thought experiment of flipping it, I mean, the Rebel Alliance does a lot of things that look a bit kind of terroristy. And, the Jedi do seem like kind of a sort of mystical old religion that sort of pops up to destabilize things. And when they were in charge, it doesn't seem like things were particularly stable and well governed. Was the Empire not just trying to provide, what was it Margaret Thatcher used to say, the smack of firm government? Maybe that's what was going on. So that's another reading to another way to think about this. There's also kind of the libertarian view in which the Empire does again become the bad guys, but largely because they're just trying to control people, and the Empire is to libertarians sort of again the American government, but not in the way that Lucas meant it. It's just like meddling government that doesn't give people a sphere of personal autonomy. So I don't have the decisive answer for you as to how the Star Wars universe works. I'm not sure Lucas did. At the time, but I think there's some of the ways that we could think about it.
That's where I've come down to, Stephen, on this is here I am. I don't know what it was like for George Lucas to try to get this vision of his made. And there are many stories, including a wonderful podcast about it, about the making of. But the whole idea of, well, he's a filmmaker. He's doing American Graffiti, and he's got this idea and he's putting it together. Why is it fair for me to say, well, you should have had a fully fleshed out system, like a graduate level system of interplanetary governance and structures? Come on, that's a lot of lore to expect somebody to build into their film when they don't know that they'll get past one movie. They don't know if they'll get through one movie, but they don't know if they'll be able to ever make a second one, much less 9, much less Star Wars stories for Rogue One and Solo and Mandalorian TV shows. There was none of that. In the mid-70s, he's writing this. It's unfair to say that he should have paid attention in all of his political science classes and worked out exactly what happened in political crises that led to this state of governance. I still would like it, though, right? I still want it to make sense because there is such an interesting set of characters and circumstances and worlds that I want it to be more like Game of Thrones, which George Martin did do some of that thinking. He was much more aware of what was necessary for this world to make sense over time, and perhaps spent too much time on it, given how long it's taking him to finish the damn novels. But clearly there's a payoff for some readers and watchers of the TV show with Game of Thrones, that I get the political circumstances behind it. And I can see some episodes, not just about the ethical decisions of the characters, but about the very structures of politics and how they lead to those horrible positions for the characters themselves.
Yeah, and Madden was a sort of student of history, and he'd studied kind of the War of the Roses, in England, was his kind of initial analogy for what was going on there. And Game of Thrones is it's I think you're right. It's a good comparison to draw. It's sort of the opposite in terms of textual detail and backstory to Star Wars. I mean, obviously they're in different media, but I think you're right that is a very different level of detail that we are provided. And for lovers of Game of Thrones, that I think is one of the great attractions, that not these characters, but these families, these dynasties have huge, long, and intricately plotted histories. And so everything has a kind of weight and and a heft and a plausibility and a believability. And I mean, the Game of Thrones universe is quite sort of interesting in that there is no sort of technological development that's going on. I mean, this is a sort of Malthusian society and situation. And I always get the timelines of these confused, but the more recent one, the House of the Dragon, is set like hundreds of years before Game of Thrones, the series, and nothing is different and nothing has changed in those 300 years. Society is stagnant.
Well, Stephen, this has been a great conversation. And if listeners have stuck with us for 90 minutes on this, then I'll point all of them to a few resources, which we'll link to in the show notes. First of all, your more traditional political science books, The Blair Identity, and also Leaders in Conflict. But then two books you've written that have to do with these intersections between pop culture and international relations and political science. One, Otherworldly Politics, the international relations of Star Trek, Game of Thrones, and Battlestar Galactica, as well as the more recent one, Imagining Politics, Interpretations in Political Science and Political Television. So plenty to read about. But before we close, I do need to ask you another question because we have our chatterbox and it is curious. Let us see. What book or books are on your nightstand or on your list of Audible books coming up?
So I use a Kindle, so I guess it is on my nightstand at various points. I'm reading at the moment, so I'll give you what I'm reading and what I'm going to read next. I'm reading at the moment a book called Children of Time. I believe, so this is a trilogy of books, I believe, and I'm reading the final one. I believe that's what it's called, but they all have similar titles. And the author's name, I'm pretty sure, is Andrei. It's not Tarkovsky because that's a famous director, but it's very close to, I'm blocking on the name, but Children of Time trilogy is the one that will get you in the right place. And this is a fascinating series of novels that posits an expansive human civilization. It's science fiction, an expansive human civilization that has introduced kind of through genetic engineering new abilities to common creatures like spiders and octopi. No one ever knows the plural of that. To the point that these have become sentient species with their own worlds. And it's just sort of a fascinating trilogy of books. So the trilogy that ends with Children of Time is what I'm finishing off at the moment. And then I'm going to read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian after that. And Cormac McCarthy recently died. And I've read some McCarthy and seen some of the film adaptations. I loved The Road. He's kind of post-apocalypse thriller. And I became a father a couple of years ago myself, and The Road really, hits differently. It's about a father and a son trying to survive after a terrible catastrophe. Really hits differently after you've had a child. And, I'm really looking forward to getting into Blood Meridian, which I think is sort of considered McCarthy's, one of his masterworks.
Absolutely. Thank you for being so generous with your time and sharing with us your insights on both ways of structuring thought about politics and international relations, but also all of the time you've put into watching all of these shows and films. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. All of the time when I should have been working, some would say, but I would say it's real work. And thank you. I've really enjoyed being on the podcast.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.